Now Charles stood at the very pinnacle of the British state, a sovereign who had spent his entire life waiting for the heavy, quiet burden of the crown. He was no longer the prince in waiting, but the reigning monarch carrying the ancient and unspoken duties of his ancestors. The long transition had ended, and the reality of his ultimate authority had finally begun to settle around him in the quiet, historic rooms of his palace. But of course, the weight of this position did not merely rest on public ceremonies, state dinners, or constitutional duties. As the supreme head of the royal house, he held absolute authority over the private estates, the vast ancestral lands, and the confidential heritages that had accumulated over centuries of dynastic rule. He was the final arbiter of family legacy, the one whose ultimate approval could redefine the material and symbolic future of the House of Windsor, ensuring that every asset remained aligned with the preservation of the crown. And yet among these immense responsibilities, none was more sensitive or privately scrutinized than the quiet distribution of the late Queen's personal unbequeathed possessions. These were the intimate heirlooms that existed entirely outside the official crown jewels, items that carried no constitutional weight, but held immeasurable emotional and historic value for the family. Managing these items required absolute discretion, a task that fell directly to the sovereign himself, as he sought to balance family expectations with the long-term stability of the dynasty. Well resting on his mahogany desk was a single, unremarkable object that would guide this process, a dark, leather-bound estate schedule compiled by his private secretaries. This document contained list after list of personal items, private ledgers, and emotional family tokens waiting for their final quiet allocation. It was an ordinary administrative record, the kind of paperwork that filled the palace archives by the thousands, demanding routine approval and little else. But then, as he scanned the final pages, his eyes fell upon a single handwritten annotation that changed the entire direction of the distribution. A name had been placed beside the most cherished personal carriage-driving assets of his late mother, written in the margins in a clear, deliberate script. It was a detail so small that an outsider would have missed it entirely, yet it stood out like a sudden whisper in the silent room, raising a quiet question that could not be easily answered. Indeed, Charles stared at the written name, his hand resting quietly on the edge of the leather-bound ledger. This specific document, the private estate schedule, was designed to be entirely routine, a bureaucratic necessity that usually passed through the hands of lawyers and trustees without causing a single ripple of family tension. Year after year, these schedules were drawn up, approved, and filed away into the deep royal archives, invisible to the public, and barely discussed among the family members themselves. It was the standard mechanism of dynastic continuity, designed to maintain the appearance of perfect order. But you see the handwritten entry before him disrupted that carefully maintained normality. Next to the entry for the late Queen's most cherished carriage-driving horses and the custom-built green carriage that had belonged to Prince Philip, sat the name of Lady Louise Windsor. It was an irregularity that broke from the traditional expectations of royal inheritance. Usually the highly visible personal collections of past monarchs remained closely held by the immediate line of succession, or were distributed in a way that reinforced the standing of the senior working members of the family. His reaction, mind you, was immediate but entirely silent. He did not call for his advisors, nor did he make a single sound in the quiet library. He simply closed the leather folder, the heavy paper making a soft whisper as it settled. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers intertwined, staring at the gold-embossed crest on the cover of the book. To anyone watching, it would have seemed like a momentary pause in a long afternoon of paperwork, but the quiet tension in the room was palpable. After all, the private schedule was never meant to be a source of conflict. It was supposed to be a quiet transition, a way to honour the past without disturbing the present. Yet, by placing those specific emotionally charged items into the hands of a young granddaughter who stood far down the line of succession, the late Queen had made a silent but undeniable statement. It was a choice that bypassed the traditional expectations of the household, leaving a legacy that could not be easily integrated into the current structure of the family. And so as the silence stretched, he reopened the ledger to examine the date of the entry. This was not a hurried final decision made in the twilight of his mother's reign. The instruction had been recorded years earlier, a deliberate and calculated act of trust that had been kept quiet until now. The public remained completely unaware of the quiet legacy that had been set in motion. But inside the palace, the first cracks in the family's unified front were beginning to show. Well, that single name had remained inside the private records, protected by protocol and absolute discretion. Charles knew exactly what the consequences would be when the details of this specific inheritance finally became known to the rest of the family. The quiet granddaughter had been chosen, and in the world of the court, being chosen changed everything. Now, to almost everyone outside the palace walls, the name of Lady Louise Windsor evoked an image of quiet, unremarkable dedication. She had spent her entire life on the periphery of the royal spotlight, a young woman who seemed to actively choose the shadows over the intense glare of public life. At 21 years old, she had established a reputation for a rare kind of modern discretion, attending university at St Andrews, just as her cousin William had done decades before, and even spending her summer breaks working quietly at a local garden centre. She competed in carriage-driving events under a modest name, avoiding the grand titles that her birthright naturally offered. Indeed, she was, by all accounts, the last person anyone would expect to find at the centre of a brewing family storm. But those who understood the inner workings of the royal household knew that her quiet demeanour masked a deeply significant position within the family ecosystem. She was not just another grandchild. She had been, according to those who observed them closely, the favourite grandchild of the late Queen. Their bond was forged not in the formal rooms of state, but in the private, relaxed spaces of Balmoral and Windsor, far from the demands of the crown. Well, this special status was partly rooted in her fragile start in life. Having been born a month early after her mother Sophie faced a severe health crisis, that dramatic beginning endeared her deeply to both of her grandparents, who watched over her development with a unique intensity. While William and Harry were already navigating the complex pressures of their teenage years, Louise was still a young child, allowing the Queen to experience a simpler, more traditional grandmotherly relationship. There were no cameras, no press releases, and no protocol when they sat together in the private quarters, watching children's television programs or walking through the gardens. And of course, as she grew, she also captured the heart of Prince Philip, sharing his deep and enduring passion for carriage-driving. This was not a casual weekend hobby for the Duke of Edinburgh. It was a sport he had helped pioneer in Britain, a defining element of his personal identity that he pursued well into his 80s. By dedicating herself to the same discipline, Louise did not just inherit a pastime. She inherited his respect. When Philip passed away, his most cherished personal possessions, his custom-built green carriage and his trusted fell ponies, did not go to his children or the direct heirs to the throne. They went directly to Louise. Yet surprisingly, despite this extraordinary validation, from both of her grandparents, Louise chose a path of remarkable restraint. When she reached her 18th birthday and held the legal right to claim the title of princess and the style of Her Royal Highness, she quietly declined, preferring to remain simply Lady Louise. She chose a life of substance over a life of status, focusing on her studies and her military training, rather than the hollow prestige of royal rank. This decision gave her a unique form of power, allowing her to build genuine credibility while remaining free from the bitter public backlash that had plagued other members of her generation. But mind you, this quiet strategy, so admired by the public, was viewed with a very different lens by other factions within the family. For while Louise was quietly accumulating these deeply personal tokens of royal approval, another household was watching her growing influence with increasing unease. The inheritance of the carriage and the private equestrian items was not seen as a simple grandmotherly gesture. It was seen as a deliberate symbolic line drawn between the bloodline and those who had married into the family. Indeed, the ledger on Charles's desk had revealed where these historic treasures were headed, but it did not explain the quiet storm that was already gathering in the private apartments of the palace. For long before Louise's inheritance became public, her quiet rise had already triggered a confrontation that would test the very limits of the king's authority. But you see, the modern tension did not begin with the public disclosure of the late Queen's will. It actually started much earlier, during a private family gathering at Sandringham, shortly after the sovereign's funeral, long before the winter frost had settled over the Norfolk estate. There was one private moment that almost no one outside the palace walls ever knew about, a quiet evening meeting that would set the course for months of family division. It was here, in a small drawing room heated by a crackling fire, that the practical realities of the inheritance were first laid bare before the family. Well present in the room were only the King, Queen Camilla, and a senior trustee of the royal estate who had served the crown for over 3 decades. The atmosphere was deliberately informal, yet the air was thick with the quiet anxiety that always accompanies the transition of power. On the low table between them lay several blue-bound portfolios containing the inventories of the late Queen's personal residences. No decisions had been made public, leaving the family in a rare moment of absolute privacy. The trustee spoke first, his voice low and measured, as he began to read through the proposed distribution of the personal effects. He spoke of the vast collections of art, the historic books, and the personal carriage-driving equipment that had remained at Windsor. For several minutes, the conversation remained entirely technical, focused on tax exemptions and the legal preservation of the estate. Charles listened in silence, nodding occasionally, while Camilla watched with a polite, guarded expression. The first real hint of disagreement appeared when the discussion shifted to the personal items that carried the most intimate family memories. The trustee quietly noted that per the late Queen's explicit written wishes, several key pieces of equestrian equipment, along with the custom green carriage inherited from Prince Philip, were to be transferred directly to Lady Louise Windsor. It was a minor point in a document containing thousands of items, but it immediately changed the temperature in the room. Camilla's posture stiffened slightly. For of course the real issue beneath the surface was not the material value of the carriage, but what its allocation represented. Camilla's own children, Tom and Laura, had been fully integrated into the family's social life, even serving as pages of honour at the coronation. They were loved present and treated as family during holidays. Yet, as the inventory made clear, they were entirely absent from the symbolic legacy of the crown. Every historical token, every piece of personal history was being directed exclusively to the bloodline, leaving her descendants on the outside. And then came the quiet, shocking moment that permanently altered the direction of the evening, when Camilla gently suggested that perhaps some of the smaller personal items could be shared more broadly among the grandchildren, including her own. Charles paused. He looked at his wife and quietly but firmly stated that the personal estate of the late sovereign must remain strictly within the royal bloodline. It was a decision, he explained, that could not be negotiated, as it reflected the fundamental principles of the institution they served. The reaction naturally was entirely silent. Camilla did not argue, nor did she raise her voice. She simply looked away, her gaze fixing on the fire as the trustee quietly turned the page. The silence in the room became heavier than any spoken word, a cold reminder of the unbridgeable distance between being married into the family and being a legitimate part of its history. The meeting continued, but the emotional warmth had entirely drained from the room. Well, the trustee eventually closed his portfolio and slipped out, leaving the king and queen alone. The official decisions had been presented, but the personal fallout was only beginning. The hidden trigger had been pulled, and the quiet understanding that had kept the peace for years had been shattered in a single evening. Because what happened after the trustee left the room, when the doors were closed and the formal masks were finally removed, would lead to the most intense private confrontation of the king's early reign. The family conversation had ended, but the battle for legacy was about to begin. Now Camilla stood by the tall sash window, her back turned to the king as she stared out into the dark, rain-swept gardens of Sandringham. The heavy oak doors had been closed, and the quiet presence of the staff had retreated down the long carpeted corridors of the house. Inside the room, the silence was almost deafening, broken only by the quiet pop of the dying embers in the hearth. The formal masks that both had worn so carefully throughout the long public funeral had finally been discarded, leaving only two people who had spent a lifetime navigating the complex boundaries between private love and public duty. Charles, meanwhile, remained seated at his desk, his hand resting on the closed leather folder that contained the disputed estate schedule. He did not speak immediately, choosing instead to watch the quiet stiffness of his wife's shoulders. The tension between them was not the loud, dramatic anger that had characterized their younger years, but a cold, weary friction that had built up over decades of maintaining appearances. When she finally turned to face him, her expression was remarkably calm, but her eyes held a quiet intensity that revealed the depth of her frustration. "Indeed?" she asked him, her voice barely above a whisper, if this was how the future was always going to be. She did not raise her voice, but the question carried the weight of years of silent compromise, of enduring public hostility, and of working tirelessly to secure her place beside him on the throne. To have her children and grandchildren so completely excluded from even the smallest tokens of family history felt like a quiet, deliberate erasure. It was a sign, she suggested, that despite all her efforts, her family would always be treated as second-class citizens within the royal household. Well, Charles looked up from the desk, his expression weary but resolute. He told her quietly that the distribution of his mother's personal effects was not a reflection of his personal feelings, nor was it a slight against her children. He reminded her that Tom and Laura were deeply loved, and that their inclusion in the family's private life had never been questioned. But when it came to the physical legacy of the sovereign, there were rules and expectations that went far beyond personal affection. The crown, he explained, was an institution built on the absolute continuity of blood, and that continuity had to be visible in every inheritance. And so, to emphasize his point, he reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a single sheet of paper, slide moving it across the polished mahogany toward her. It was a private letter, written by Queen Elizabeth several years before her death, detailing her specific wishes for her personal collection. The document was written in her familiar, elegant hand, and it left no room for interpretation. She had explicitly stated that her most treasured personal items, particularly those connected to her life at Windsor and her shared passions with Prince Philip, must go to Lady Louise Windsor. Camilla, of course, did not pick up the paper. She simply stared down at the elegant handwriting, her mouth tightening into a thin line. The realization that this was not a sudden decision made by her husband, but a long-planned legacy, orchestrated by the late Queen, made the exclusion feel even more permanent. It was a clear indication that the previous generation had seen a bright, unyielding line between the biological family and those who had married in. The silence in the room deepened the emotional distance between them, expanding with every passing second. Then he spoke again, his voice dropping to a low, steady tone that carried the absolute weight of his sovereign authority. He delivered a single sentence that seemed to hang in the quiet room, changing the emotional direction of their conversation forever. He told her that while they could share their lives, they could never share the dynasty. It was an unforgettable statement, a quiet reminder of the unyielding boundary that separated their personal marriage from the cold reality of the British crown. Indeed, Camilla absorbed the words in silence, her expression hardening, as she realized that no amount of discussion would change the outcome. There was no shouting, no dramatic exit, and no tearful breakdown. She simply walked back to the window, her gaze returning to the darkness outside, while Charles remained at his desk, the closed folder sitting between them like an insurmountable barrier. The confrontation had ended, but nothing had been resolved. Well, the private conversation had reached its limit, and the emotional fallout was now locked behind closed doors. But inside the palace, personal feelings could never be allowed to disrupt the orderly progress of the state. The family conflict had reached an impasse, and the machinery of the monarchy was already preparing to take control of the narrative, ensuring that the private divisions would never be allowed to threaten the stability of the crown. And so Charles now sat alone in the quiet study, the distant hum of the palace estate, the only sound remaining in the deep silence of the night. The private confrontation had ended, leaving behind a cold, unspoken tension, but the sovereign knew that personal emotions could never be permitted to delay the relentless machinery of the crown. The matter had officially moved beyond the family circle, entering the formal administrative processes of the monarchy. Personal feelings had to be set aside as the official apparatus of the institution took complete control of the situation. Indeed, within hours, the quiet work of the palace began, guided by the private secretaries, the senior legal advisors, and the constitutional experts who managed the transition of royal estates. These officials operated in a world entirely separate from family sentiment, viewing every inheritance not as a matter of personal affection, but as a question of institutional precedent and legal clarity. They gathered in quiet offices reviewing the complex legal frameworks that separate the monarch's private property from the official assets of the state, ensuring that every transition was perfectly aligned with the law. Well, the official review process began with a meticulous examination of the late Queen's private estate. This was not a casual inventory, but a rigorous constitutional and legal review designed to protect the privacy of the sovereign's will. Unlike ordinary citizens, royal wills are traditionally sealed to protect the family's privacy, but the internal distribution of assets requires absolute precision. The legal advisors drafted confidential memoranda outlining the precise boundaries of the inheritance and ensuring that every item was transferred in strict accordance with the late sovereign's written instructions. And as the review progressed, the institution quietly began preparing for the practical implementation of the decisions. Palace officials prepared revised schedules, drafted internal correspondence, and prepared sealed instructions for the various royal households. Every step was executed with absolute discretion, ensuring that no hint of the family's internal divisions would reach the public. The focus was entirely on maintaining the appearance of flawless stability, a task that required the absolute cooperation of everyone involved, regardless of their personal feelings. This entire process, of course, highlighted the eternal conflict between personal emotion and dynastic duty. while Camilla and Charles continued to appear together at public engagements, projecting an image of unified support. The legal machinery behind the scenes continued its relentless progress. In the world of the court, personal preferences were always secondary to the preservation of the institution's integrity. The sovereign's primary responsibility was to protect the legacy of the crown, even when that responsibility required making choices that caused deep personal pain within his own household. Ultimately, you see, the institution delivered its final binding decision regarding the disputed estate schedule. The senior legal advisors formally confirmed that the late Queen's personal equestrian assets, including the custom-built carriage and the fell ponies, would be transferred solely to Lady Louise Windsor without any secondary distribution or compromise. There would be no shared items, no division of the collection, and no concessions made to non-bloodline members of the family. The written wishes of the late monarch would be executed exactly as they had been recorded. And of course, this decision immediately changed the quiet balance of power within the palace walls. It was a clear authoritative statement that reaffirmed the absolute priority of the bloodline over any marital integration. By formally securing Louise's sole inheritance, the institution had quietly but unmistakably signalled her elevated position within the family's future plans. The decision established a precedent that would guide the distribution of all future personal estates, reinforcing the strict boundaries that protected the royal legacy. Yet surprisingly, despite the significance of this decision, the outside world remained entirely unaware of the shift. No official press releases were issued, and no public statements were made to the media. The transition was handled with the quiet efficiency that has preserved the monarchy for centuries, kept entirely behind the high stone walls of the royal residences. The institution had acted securing its legacy, while the nation remained completely oblivious to the quiet drama that had unfolded. Indeed, the formal decisions had been finalised and the legal documents had been signed and sealed, but while the paperwork was complete, the practical consequences of the decision were only beginning to manifest within the daily life of the court. The legal battle had ended, but the visible reality of the new order was about to become clear to everyone inside the palace. Now Charles watched from the study window as the early morning mist slowly lifted over the royal mews, revealing the first practical consequences of the institution's final decision. The administrative processes had run their course, and now the physical reality of the transition was beginning to reshape the daily life of the palace. There was no longer any room for hesitation or private debate. The formal instructions had been issued, and the staff had already begun the delicate work of reorganising the personal estate of the late sovereign. Well, the first visible changes were quiet but deeply symbolic, taking place in the private stables and coach houses of Windsor Castle. The late Queen's personal equestrian collection, which had remained largely untouched since her passing, was officially catalogued and prepared for transport. Teams of curators and estate workers quietly moved through the private quarters, carefully packing historical items, polishing harnesses, and preparing the custom-built green carriage that had once been Prince Philip's pride and joy. Each action was carried out with a quiet professional reverence, yet the significance of what was being moved was clear to everyone present. The palace staff, of course, responded to the transition with the absolute discretion that their positions demanded, their movements quiet and purposeful as they carried out the final instructions. Assistants packed legal documents into leather dispatch boxes. Security teams updated access codes for the private estates, and horse transport vehicles were prepared in the courtyard. There were no loud discussions or public announcements, only the steady, routine work of a household implementing a sovereign decree. The emotional weight of the transition was carried entirely in these small procedural actions. Camilla, meanwhile, witnessed these movements from a distant balcony, watching in absolute silence as the familiar carriage was rolled out of the courtyard to await its transport to Lady Louise's residence. There was no visible display of emotion, no outward sign of the quiet frustration that had dominated their private conversations, but the sight of the empty space in the coach house spoke volumes. It was a physical manifestation of the unbridgeable boundary that separated her family from the royal legacy, a visual reminder that despite her title, her descendants would always remain on the periphery of the dynasty. And so as the physical assets were relocated, the institutional adjustments began to ripple through the rest of the royal family, forcing senior members to adapt to the new reality. William assumed additional oversight over the private estates, while Princess Anne quietly stepped in to manage the broader equestrian legacies of their parents, ensuring that the transition did not disrupt the official schedule of the crown. Each member of the family was forced to adjust their responsibilities, filling the gaps left by the transition, and ensuring that the public facade of perfect unity remained completely unbroken. Indeed, the deeply personal nature of the transition was captured in a single quiet moment in the royal mews. Resting on the seat of the custom carriage was a small, hand-polished brass nameplate bearing the name of Lady Louise Windsor, freshly engraved by the palace jewellers. It was a tiny detail almost invisible from a distance, yet it represented the definitive passing of the torch from one generation of carriage drivers to the next. The object sat in the quiet morning light, a tangible symbol of the late grandparents' trust, and a permanent reminder of the quiet princess who had been chosen to carry their legacy forward. These consequences, you see, would continue to expand far beyond the walls of the stables, shaping the future planning of the monarchy for years to come. By securing this personal legacy, Louise was quietly positioned not just as an heir to family trinkets, but as a key asset for the future of the crown under her cousin William's eventual reign. As the pool of active working royals grew smaller, her quiet competence, military training, and symbolic inheritance made her an increasingly valuable resource for an institution that was preparing for a slimmed-down, highly focused future. Yet, of course, as the transport vehicles finally departed the palace gates, the public remained completely unaware of the quiet restructuring that had taken place. The outside world saw only the official engagements and the carefully curated public appearances, entirely missing the profound shift that had occurred within the family hierarchy. The dynasty had quietly redrawn its internal boundaries, securing its bloodline and protecting its future, while maintaining the flawless illusion of an undivided household. Well, the carriage had gone, and the quiet princess had received her inheritance, leaving the palace to settle back into its routine of quiet majesty. But while the physical items had been moved and the folders had been filed away, the emotional landscape of the royal house had been permanently altered. The division between blood and marriage had been made concrete, leaving a quiet, enduring tension that would continue to simmer beneath the surface of the crown for generations to come.